All right, so let's start. So want to welcome you to public meeting slash policy board presentation for the Greenup Boyd County Freight Plan. I'm Dan Hake, the project manager for HDR. We're teamed with TSW Design Group, and of course we want to thank Kiowa and the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet for sponsoring this project. First, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the Kiowa Interstate Planning Commission is. It's a multi-state MPO, and in Kentucky, that includes Greenup and Boyd County, but it's important to understand that freight knows no borders. And so we also looked across the rivers to see what was happening in the total region and beyond. So why create a freight plan? First, it's impact on communities. There's a significant impact on livability and economic development of, highway and rail traffic. Freight brings good jobs. Freight industries provide job opportunities for folks with all levels of education. Federal policy. So states right now are required to do freight plans. MPOs are not, but all signs are pointing to future legislation mandating that. So kudos to Kiowa for getting in front of that move. And then also funding. So if you're watching bills move through the House and Senate, an increased focus on discretionary programs that are focused on freight. So knowing what types of projects to pursue and what would have the most benefits for the region is very critical. So project overview. So the purpose of this plan is to develop a comprehensive understanding and profile of the existing multimodal freight network, but really it's focused on helping decision makers make funding and investment decisions that address freight needs. And the project also built upon the state freight and rail plans of Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia, and then also work that Kiowa did previously on the Ironton truck study, the multimodal economic impact study for Huntington Tri-State Airport, and then of course the Kiowa MTP, which drives everything at the MPO. So the first task was developing objectives and performance measures. And as I mentioned, I think 2 slides ago, the Metropolitan Transportation Plan drives all activities at an MPO. So it's important that the freight objectives developed by this plan supports and are truly integrated with those documents or that document. So we really looked at the MTP, but also state freight plans to try to find some commonalities and developed a series of objectives. So each of these in the left-hand column are summations of MTP goals, and on the right are objectives that fit into those goals. And the idea here is during the next Kiowa MTP update that these objectives could easily be inserted into that document and really make freight part of the Kiowa planning process and not just do this plan once and make sure this really lives on. So for example, economics, looking at giving priority to projects that improve access to intermodal facilities or basic economic development opportunities. Safety, reducing commercial truck crashes and railroad crashes. Security, looking at I-64 and other strategic bridges. And then, energy and environment, looking at detrimental impacts of freight movement on neighborhoods. So freight is a manifestation of the economy, which is a good thing. If you're moving a lot of freight, it means the economy is going well, but at the same time, there are some negative externalities that come to freight or come with freight that should be addressed, and it should be a total positive for the region. You can't manage what you don't measure, and so for each of those goals and objectives, we developed a series of performance measures for that future MTP to consider. So for example, reliability on the freight network, delay on the freight network, truck crash rate, EJ impacts, and so forth. So these things will be considered as part of the next MTP update. We also looked at the congestion management process, and this is something that normally isn't done with MPO freight plans, but I think this was a good idea. This was brought up by Salim at Kiowa, and the congestion management plan actually already addressed freight in several aspects, which after we did a desk scan, we realized it's actually kind of an outlier when it comes to MPO, so kudos to Kiowa for that. But we came up with some additional ideas that they could build upon those freight strategies they already had developed. Looking at a couple other of the MPOs that focus on freight specifically, and then leveraging our freight plan analysis, which we'll talk about shortly, and then also focusing on reliability versus congestion when it comes to freight, because trucking companies can plan around congestion that they know will be there, but when you have reliability issues, it becomes an unproductive thing that you cannot plan around. So reliability means more to the freight community than congestion. So the freight profile. So the first part of the freight profile was really defining a multimodal freight network, and then we did an existing conditions analysis and then put it all together in one whole freight profile. So we started with the Kentucky freight networks. This expands upon the national truck network and then connects that local industry to that national network. So there are 4 tiers to the Kentucky freight network. Tier 1 is most of 64 and 23. Tier 2 is portions of 64 that are not included. And then tier 3 looks at more of the state highways and US 23. And then tier 4 focuses more on that last mile connectivity. So in this example, US 60 to freight facilities there near Summit. We also use streetlight data, which is truck probe GPS data, to look at overall truck activity, to get some truck volume estimates, look at origin and destination pairs, and then identify some top routes for the bridges. So if you look at this map over here on the right, the purple triangles are where there are current cabinet truck classification stations. And as you can see, there are a lot more roads than where those triangles are. So we use streetlight data to forecast out what we believe to be an estimate of truck volumes, or in this case, truck percentages on the other road network. And one key takeaway we learned from this analysis, and it was validated by stakeholders, was the use of State Road 67 coming down through US 23 to 64 to cut the corner between traffic following along the river to going to westbound 64. Of course, we looked at truck crashes. So the majority of truck crashes were single vehicle crashes, which were runoffs or contact with a fixed object. Crash hotspots included Ashland and around the Flying J on I-64. We also looked at the Kiowa safety study to see what the correlation was between a larger crash study and one focused just on trucks, and it strongly correlated that both truck crashes and all vehicle crashes happened in very similar spaces. So it seems to be that safety challenges in the area on the whole, not specific to any location, are more all vehicle challenges versus just a truck or just a car challenge. We also looked at truck origin destination. So using that streetlight, we looked at where are truck trips that are beginning and ending in Greene and Boyd County going and coming to, and also between the 2 counties. And we found that about half of the truck trips are actually occurring within the study area. And then I would say with the remaining half, there's about an equal split between the rest of Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia. We also use that GPS data to look at what's called a top route analysis. We looked at each of the river bridges and where trucks were coming to and going from that use those bridges. So this is all of the river crossings. And so you can see how traffic goes up through Indiana and Kentucky and into Pennsylvania and past Columbus. So these are all the bridges, and then we actually created a separate map for every single one of the bridges. So you can see how each of the bridges are used within the larger region. Multimodal freight facilities. The Kentucky Cabinet has a major freight user inventory that identified 24 major freight facilities in the area. The majority of those facilities are located, either adjacent to US 52 and the Ohio River, I-64 and US 60, and then we identified a local freight network that linked between all of these facilities and the Kentucky truck network. And so these are maps that give a good example of how we did that. And so it's important not just to focus on those major freight corridors, but also ensuring that your local businesses can flourish, because it's easier to retain or expand existing business than it is to attract it. Last map. Truck parking is also something that's important. Again, another use of that streetlight data. So we looked at where are trucks stopping for over 6 hours, so where they're stopping to sleep as opposed to stopping to drop something off. In high activity areas where the Flying J Travel Plaza, which makes sense, Steel of West Virginia, and then because of this 2019 data, the AK Steel facility popped as well. Marine freight is critically important to this region. It's on N70, which is the Ohio River. There's also the Big Sandy River that's also navigable. The Port of Huntington Tri-State is in the region. And then in 2018, 42 million tons of freight valued at over $10 billion moved by waterway to or from the Greenup River Port Authority. So a lot of goods movement and a really important part of the freight system. Pipelines, so there's limited information available for pipelines due to national security interests, but also that they're regulated at the federal level. So the Marathon refinery is a major refinery that's on I-64, just off I-64, and it's a pipeline junction. And we also identified during the KIPTA, so the Louisville MPO freight plan, they identified that they use barge traffic to move jet fuel to UPS Worldport, and it turns out that the other side of that movement is in Boyd County, linking up with the Marathon refinery. So importance to statewide economy, both in terms of the pipeline, but also the refinery. Railroads, CSX has 3 different yards within the 2 counties, and there are several Norfolk Southern yards located in the neighboring counties over in West Virginia and in Ohio. Air cargo, again, because freight knows no borders, we looked at the Huntington Tri-State Airport in West Virginia, and realized they move about 21 million pounds of freight. And their major connecting cities include Memphis and Indianapolis, and that's mainly because Indianapolis and Memphis are FedEx air cargo hubs, so a lot of traffic goes to Indianapolis and Memphis, and then onward across the world, and additionally up to Rickenbacker in Columbus. We also looked at economic development, and so we did what I like to call a reverse site selection process. So if you're a site selector, you're looking at how much water and how much power and how much sewer a site can provide. And so we looked at several greenfield and brownfield sites to look at how the surrounding transportation network could either handle a proposed development opportunity or could be marketed in the future. And so, for example, over here on the right, we did one for the Unity aluminum site, and we, after talking to local economic development officials and looking at our analysis from the freight profile, we calculated that there may be some needs on 67 and on Technology Drive that may need to be addressed as that development goes into place. SWOT analysis, so this is where everything kind of comes together. So some strengths for the region. There's good rail connectivity. Inland waterway access, there's relatively low congestion. The refinery, which we talked about a few minutes ago, and site selectors actually identified the geographic location of Huntington, West Virginia, and the larger region as an ideal location for warehouses. Some weaknesses. Overall, there's a low population density and distance to metropolitan centers. 83% of Ohio River tonnage are coal and petroleum products in this part of the river. And there's some structural market challenges to that with changes to power plants. Prime industrial areas are located within the floodplain. Obviously, you're along the river. Some pavement conditions on US 23 that should be addressed. And then overall, low volumes of OD movements in the area. So the majority of truck trips into and around the area were actually through. So giving people a reason to stop and open up their trucks and their boxes. Some opportunities, despite the Ohio River moving a lot of goods, there's still a significant amount of capacity left. There's some really great brownfield redevelopment opportunities in the AK Steel plant that have several different modal connectivity points, both highway, rail, and water. There's some crash hotspots that could be addressed on I-64, and then a focus on business parks and really connectivity and access points. Some threats outside of the immediate area. Pritchard, Norfolk Southern Intermodal Yard has been closed. I know the state of West Virginia is working on reopening it, but that is definitely something that could position the area for more freight movement. Obviously, with brownfields, there are a lot of opportunity, but there's also a cost associated with that. And then from the Ohio River standpoint, flooding, low water events, and the age of lock and dams are all external threats to freight movement in Greenup and Boyd that are somewhat outside of the control of the counties or the area. So using all of this work and developing some key takeaways, we developed a series of recommendations, and these really took two forms. The first were policy programs and partnerships, and these were more subjective recommendations. And then we developed projects from both our freight profile, but also stakeholder outreach. And these projects are targeted on improving freight mobility and went through a prioritization process, which we'll talk about shortly. So for each, as I mentioned before, for each MTP goal, so Metropolitan Transportation Plan goal, we identified a freight objective that could be integrated into that future plan, and then we developed a series of recommendations that could also move along into the larger planning process. So some examples for the state of good repair MTP goal was to develop an asset management plan that focuses on key freight corridors and using bridge sensors to actively monitor river bridge conditions so that you see a problem before it becomes a problem. Exploring way in motion and looking at pavement rehab projects on corridors like US 23. For economic vitality, using this plan to leverage Kiowa's role in the larger economic development efforts of the region, but also the state. Implementing local recommendations identified by the Cabinet's Riverport study that's currently being finalized. Looking at or working with local and state development partners to identify opportunities near existing rail yards and facilities, so really leveraging your assets you already have. Similarly with Riverport's facilities and making sure that all three states have access to Huntington Airport, and then really looking at those last mile investments to ensure you provide connectivity between modes. From an operational standpoint, using travel demand management initiatives to reduce overall traffic on key freight corridors. I think something that came out of COVID was the realization that freight moved around a lot quicker when there weren't so many cars on the road. And so not just looking at capacity expansion, but Are there opportunities to do potential TDM solutions to solve freight challenges? And then also looking at microtransit and mobility as a service to potentially solve some workforce mobility challenges and getting folks to work in those freight operations. And then improving signage, both directional signage, but also DMS signs that provide information about freight detours across state lines and address major challenges when there's large construction projects or an unexpected bridge closure. From a safety aspect, so I talked earlier about us looking at how our safety analysis correlated with the Kiowa larger safety study, and so a recommendation is that that analysis move into the larger safety study the next time it's done. Looking at partnering with groups like Operation Lifesaver to improve grade crossing safety and doing spot improvements in corridors with significant crash frequency. So not just focusing on doing these large corridor projects, but actually looking at sometimes there's low-cost solutions that can have a really high value. So looking at spot improvements on those corridors. One challenge we realized we were looking at some of those economic development sites that have rail access is there's some odd geometric challenges with grade crossings, and so making sure the grade crossings that have both a high hazard index or geometric issues are prioritized. And then looking at, as we develop new economic development opportunities, making sure those grade crossing risks are mitigated. So security, so prioritizing improvements that'll harden critical infrastructure or provide resiliency. Working with local law enforcement to ensure that critical infrastructure is being monitored, and then working with statewide and multi-state homeland security efforts focused on infrastructure. For the environment, looking at potential signal timing, so reducing the slow stops and the long starts for trucks and removing some emissions by using either signal timing or signal prioritization to help overall traffic flow. And then also explore funding opportunities to leverage Kiowa's role as the MPO really as a convener to help facilitate zero emissions freight movements, whether it's electric trucks or some other alternative fuel. And then championing efforts to remediate brownfields that could serve as a prime economic development opportunity. Connectivity, so looking at creating an MPO-wide freight plan based on the framework developed by this plan. Integrating the recommendations of the Cabinet's freight study and the Riverport study. Looking at MARAD's marine highway project status to develop key projects and economic development opportunities along the rivers, or the Ohio River specifically. Advocating for maintenance and improvements on the Ohio River lock and dam system, and then providing expertise and assistance to locals as they retrofit or rehab areas with significant freight needs, and making sure that freight is integrated into those projects. And then financial responsibility. So some recommendations under this goal and objective. Looking at multimodal options before Kiowa dollars are appropriated or Kiowa supports outside funding requests to make sure that the most efficient or most advantageous mode is available and supported. And then providing expertise and assistance to local government partners who are interested in pursuing some of those national freight-related grants. So those are the policy programs and process recommendations. So we looked at, from a project perspective, we developed a project prioritization process that is largely based on the Kentucky Cabinet shift process. And so it's a four-step process. The first step is identifying projects. So We went and looked at several different sources to identify projects. So the first, obviously, is looking at the freight profile that we developed, but also we wanted to look at the small urban transportation studies, MTP, the CMP, the existing shift process, and several other documents to make sure we captured all the projects that were identified on that freight network we developed. And we went through and we scanned the project list and removed things like bike and ped lanes and things that were necessarily freight projects. And then we went through and scored each of those projects based on safety, economic development, asset management, congestion, benefit cost ratio, local priorities, and these are all the focus areas of that shift process. And then we prioritized those projects with their scores and weighted them by the weighting system developed by shift as well. So ultimately, we created a series of 4, what we're calling implementation tiers. And tier 1 are projects that Kiowa should focus on doing first because they're either a high priority or the project could be done quickly. Tier 2 are projects that should be done next. Tier 3 are more long-term projects. They either require a significant investment to develop or require planning studies. And then tier 4 are projects that Kiowa should focus on when or if a freight industry development is proposed nearby to that hypothetical project. And so this is a map showing overall prioritization from 1 to, I believe, 75 or 80, showing what the different prioritizations and the tiers would be. But we've also split them up into those tiers. So tier 1 are things that should be done immediately. So number 1 on the list are US 23 safety improvements, where the crash rate is actually over 100% greater than the state average. And then, going down through projects based on their overall readiness and the prioritization. And then for each of these individual projects or freight needs would probably be a better way to describe it. There's a 1/2 page summary of the project, approximate project cost, and then how that individual project scored. So you can see the details in a way that's digestible versus trying to pull it out of a spreadsheet. Similarly for tier 2, here's how tier 2 shook out. So the number 1 project on here is Kentucky 207 operational improvements. And looking at safety improvements in I-64, which was a freight profile project. And again, we have 1/2 page breakouts for each of these projects. Tier 3, and then tier 4. And overall, wanted to thank Kiowa and the cabinet again for this opportunity. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is in the bottom, or Salim or Jeremy from the cabinet would be happy to answer your questions as well.